The afternoon sun burned high above the wide Texas sky, stretching shadows long across the dry earth, where the golden wheat swayed against the whisper of the wind. And in the middle of this endless horizon, a cowboy named Luke Carson leaned on the worn handle of his shovel, sweat beading across his brow. The brim of his hat tipped low as he surveyed the stretch of his land. Land he had worked with calloused hands and stubborn heart. The same land that had been his father's and his father's before him. Yet as he paused for a moment to take in the silence, a silence broken only by the soft rustling of the fields, his sharp eyes caught movement near the fence line, something small, uneven, like a shadow swaying against the heat. And as he stepped closer, he realized it. Wasn't an animal or a trick of the sun. It was a woman stumbling, her dress torn at the hem, her hair wild as though the wind itself had tried to claim her, her face pale and her lips cracked, as though every drop of water had abandoned her long before she reached his land. And in that instant Luke didn't think, didn't hesitate. He dropped his shovel and rushed across the rows, his boots pounding against the earth, his voice breaking through the silence with urgency. "Ma'am, are you all right?" But she could barely answer, her voice nothing more than a whisper that tangled in the wind. And when her knees buckled, he caught her, strong arms holding her against his chest as though she were made of glass, fragile and precious. And without a second thought, he carried her to the porch of his ranch house, the wooden boards creaking under his boots, setting her down gently as though she belonged there all along. Then he poured her a glass of water, the clear liquid catching the sunlight like a jewel. And when she pressed it to her lips, she drank as though life itself had been given back to her, each swallow bringing color to her cheeks again. And for a long moment she stared at him, those wide eyes filled with something between fear and relief. And finally she whispered her name, Clara, just Clara, no last name, no explanation of where she had come from. And Luke, though curious, didn't press, for he could see in her gaze the weight of miles, of burdens carried far too long. So he only nodded and told her she was safe now. And in that small promise, something unspoken passed between them, something that felt heavier than words, lighter than air. Something that filled the space between them with quiet understanding. And over the days that followed, Clara remained on his land, at first resting, her body still weak from whatever trials had driven her to collapse in his field. But slowly her spirit began to shine, and Luke, a man who had known the silence of solitude longer than he cared to admit, found himself listening to the sound of her laughter echo across the porch, watching her walk through the fields with bare feet brushing the wheat. And with every passing day he realized she wasn't just the ache of her chest loosening, as though every sunrise here stripped away another layer of fear she had carried. From the life she fled, yet just as she found comfort in the rhythm of the ranch, a shadow lingered at the edges of her thoughts, a shadow shaped like the men she had run from. Men who believed she belonged to them, men who had bound her with promises written in cruelty and blood. And though she did not yet tell Luke the full story, she feared the day they might come searching. But Luke, whose heart had sensed that storm before she even spoke it aloud, already knew she carried more than exhaustion. He knew she bore scars no one could see, and so he worked quietly, building her trust, never asking too much, only giving her steady kindness in the form of small things, a hand steadying hers when she fumbled with the reins, a plate of food left out when she forgot to eat, a lantern lit on the porch when she wandered late into the night to breathe under the stars. And Clara, piece by piece, began to open like the petals of a flower kissed by morning sun, telling him fragments of her story, how she had been promised to a man twice her age, a man with land and money but no soul, how she had refused, how she had fled into the night with nothing but the clothes on her back. And Luke's jaw clenched when he heard, his eyes dark with anger, though his touch remained gentle. And he said in a low voice that carried the weight of steel, "You'll never go back to that, Clara, not while I'm breathing." And though she trembled at the thought of pursuit, she believed him, because when Luke spoke, the earth itself seemed to listen. And in the weeks that followed, they fell into rhythm, a rhythm that felt like belonging, Clara learning to mend fences, to feed the horses, to ride under his guidance, and Luke discovering laughter he hadn't known he still carried. But peace was fragile, and peace in stories like theirs is always tested. And one late afternoon, as the sun bled across the wheat in rivers of fire, they heard the sound of hooves thundering down the dirt road, a sound that made Clara freeze, the mug slipping from her hands to shatter on the porch. For she knew that sound, had feared it every night. And when she turned, she saw them, 3 riders, dust rising behind them, their eyes sharp, their mouths twisted with the certainty of men who thought they owned the world. And the leader, broad-shouldered with a cruel scar across his cheek, dismounted with the arrogance of someone who had always taken what he wanted. And his voice cut the air like a blade. "Clara, you've given us a lot of trouble. Time to come home." And Clara stepped back, her body trembling, her voice caught in her throat. But Luke moved before she could answer, standing between her and the men, his frame steady, his hat casting shadow over eyes that burned with a storm. And he said, low and unyielding, "She's not going anywhere." And for a heartbeat the air was heavy, silence hanging, like a coiled snake, until the scarred man spat on the ground and sneered, "She belongs to me." And Luke, calm but fierce, answered, "She belongs to herself. And if you think you'll take her, you'll have to go through me." And tension cracked like lightning. The other men shifting in their saddles, hands brushing near their holsters. But Clara, who had lived too long in fear, saw in Luke's stance something she had never known, protection that asked for nothing in return, love that fought not out of possession, but out of devotion. And as tears blurred her vision, she realized this moment was the turning point, the place where she either gave in to fear or chose to stand with him. So with trembling hands she stepped to his side, her voice clear though her body shook, "I'm not going back. Not ever." And in that moment, though danger loomed, Luke felt pride swell in his chest because Clara had found her courage. And with her declaration, the scarred man's smirk twisted to rage. But he also saw something in Luke's eyes, something unbreakable. And perhaps he knew in his bones that this cowboy was not a man who bluffed, not a man who would ever yield. And after a long, tense silence, he mounted his horse again, spitting curses as he turned away, his men following, though not without dark glares that promised the threat wasn't gone. And as the thunder of hooves faded into the distance, Clara collapsed against Luke, her body shaking with sobs that were half relief and half terror of what might come. And Luke wrapped her in his arms, pressing his lips to her hair as he whispered, "It's over. They won't take you, not while I stand." And though both knew the men might return, in that embrace, Clara felt safer than she had ever felt, because safety wasn't the absence of danger, it was the presence of someone who would face it with you. And as the days turned into nights and nights into weeks, their bond deepened into something unshakable, love not just born of kindness, but forged in fire. And Luke, once a solitary man of the land, became her anchor, while Clara, once a woman lost, became the reason his world bloomed brighter. And together they wrote a story stronger than fear, a story of love that defied chains. And as the stars stretched endless above them on quiet nights, they both knew that forever had already begun the moment she stumbled into his field and he gave her water, because love, once planted, grows roots deeper than any storm can tear away. And if this chapter of their story has moved your heart, dear listener, if you believe in love that stands unshaken against darkness, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because more tales of devotion, courage, and unbreakable love await you here. And your support helps keep these stories alive for every soul that needs a reminder that love, no matter how lost, will always find its way home. Stranger who had stumbled onto his land, she was the answer to the loneliness he had buried deep inside, the light his weary soul had been waiting for, though he dared not confess it yet. For love, he believed, was something too sacred to rush. Yet Clara saw it in him even before he spoke, in the way his hand steadied her when she faltered, in the way he looked at her as though she were a miracle instead of a burden. And she too began to trust, little by little. her heart softening as the days passed, for she had run from something dark, something cruel, though she spoke of it rarely, only hinting at the nights filled with voices raised in anger, the chains of promises forced upon her, and Luke listened, not with judgment, but with the patience of a man who understood storms must be weathered before skies clear. And in that patience she found safety, until one evening when the sun melted behind the horizon, painting the sky in fire and gold. Clara turned to him on the porch, her hands trembling as she said, "I don't know what comes next, Luke. I don't even know if I can ever be free of what's behind me." And Luke, with all the quiet certainty of the earth itself, laid his hand over hers and said, "You don't have to know what comes next. Clara, not today, not tomorrow. All you have to know is that you're not alone anymore. You've got me for as long as you'll have me." And in those words her tears fell, not of sorrow but of release, because for the first time someone had chosen her, not for what she could give, not for what she could endure, but for who she was, lost and weary and yet still shining. And from that night forward their bond grew stronger, love blooming in the simplest acts, sharing coffee at dawn, working side by side under the sun, tending to the horses, watching the stars in silence, each moment weaving their hearts closer until there was no question left between them, until the land itself seemed to breathe easier with their laughter. And though the world outside might still search for her, though the shadows of her past might linger, Clara had found her home in Luke, and Luke, who once thought the earth his only companion, had found his forever in her. All because on a scorching afternoon, a lost woman stumbled into his field, and he gave her water. And in that water flowed love that would never run dry. And if you've been touched by their story, dear listener, if you believe in the kind of love that grows out of kindness and patience and faith, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because here we bring you more stories that warm the heart, stir the soul, and remind you that love, no matter how lost we are, always finds a way home. The morning came softly. The sky brushed with lavender hues as dawn stretched across the horizon, and Clara stood at the porch rail, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee Luke had poured for her, the steam curling like secrets into the cool air, and for the first time in so long she felt